And here we go. Thanks so much, Brooke, for agreeing to talk here. Brooke Foucault Welles is going to talk about hashtag activism. Brooke is a co-author on a book that came recently out on this topic, so I'm very excited to hear about that. Brooke is, everybody agrees, an excellent speaker and a star in the field. I've got so many emails when I started the seminar saying, you need to get Brooke to talk. So I'm really happy that you're here today. Thanks for doing this, and take it away, Brooke.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Very generous, and thanks for coordinating this seminar series. So for those, I actually can't see who, hang on, I'm gonna click a button just to see the list of everyone who's here. Alrighty, nice to see you all. Now I'm gonna click a different button. So, all right. So for those who don't know me, my name is Brooke. I'm an associate professor of communication studies and network science at Northeastern University. Among other things, I was one of the original co-founders of WiNS, which I am pleased to see has taken on a life of its own, including more and more people. If you aren't already in our Facebook group, please send me a little message to join. You can just search us on Facebook, Women in Network Science or WiNS, ought to get you to the right place. Do just write a couple of words in the questions, the membership questions, so I can let you in. So we've had a few folks kind of trolls try to join. So I've had to crack down on the membership questions a little bit. I'm going to talk to you today. The kind of work I do is I come from a social networks background, a social science background, and so my work tends to be a bit more applied in the kind of range of possible applications of network science. I'm on the sort of applied case study end, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that led up to our book, which came out right as the pandemic hit, so good times, and explain to you a little bit the kind of theory of what we're arguing in the book, as well as some of the network science that enabled the book. And at the outset, I'll note that this work is done in collaboration with Sarah Jackson and Moya Bailey, who are fabulous critical scholars who do all the qualitative work that's associated with what you're going to see. So here we go. What I study is hashtag activism. So this, broadly speaking, is the process of using hashtags to create social change. Many of you have probably heard of various hashtags that I would classify as hashtag activism, but just in case, we have seen, and I will talk about in more detail today, hashtags like GirlsLikeUs, which is a trans advocacy hashtag. Of course, there's also Black Lives Matter, which started as a hashtag and has since become a formal social movement organization. And more recently, Me Too, which proliferated not only online, but through various offline and hybrid organizations in order to create, I think we would all agree, fairly radical, transformative social justice change in the world. I used to have this preamble to a talk like this about online activism being real activism. I do think that still sometimes people think like, well, it's not like actual activism, right? It's just sort of lazy activism. I've heard the term slacktivism thrown around. And our book really tries to challenge that and situate online activism, including hashtag activism, alongside other forms of media-based activism. So although hashtag activism in particular is new, it is not uncommon historically to find examples of marginalized groups using media in order to challenge mainstream narratives. Now here, we need to have a little bit of a run through communication theory, but the idea here is that the mainstream media, here we're talking about major news outlets like in the US, maybe in the New York Times, or CNN, maybe BBC, and places like that. So those big mainstream outlets can only cover so much information. So they pick and choose what they're going to cover. And the things that they cover don't necessarily influence what people think about those topics, but they influence people to think that those topics are important. So the kind of refrain that we all learn in Com 101 is the media don't tell you what to think, but they tell you what to think about. So given that, marginalized groups, and here we're talking about people like trans folks, people of color, even women in some cases, people with disabilities and so on, often don't get covered in the mainstream media. And so they've taken to alternate forms of media in order to get attention. And historically, they've done this by, for example, developing their own presses, like the historical Black press in the US, started by freed slaves in order to tell the stories that needed to be told about slavery and anti-slavery institutions. We also saw leaflets in the first and second wave feminist movements. So women would put together kind of calls to action or information pamphlets and hand them out literally in the streets. Even sort of big speeches, sort of galvanizing rallies and things like that could be constituted as a form of media control or reclaiming the media in order to cover issues that matter. So we argue in the book that hashtag activism is just a kind of modern day iteration of that. And we specifically show how this works by not just looking at streams of tweets like you see here, but of course transforming them into networks. So when we transform them into networks like this, so I assume most on this call are familiar with what we're looking at here. These are various images of Twitter networks where the users are nodes in the network. And the links are interactions. Typically, it's retweets in cases of online activism, although this, when I created the networks, I sort of collapsed retweets, mentions, and quote retweets into a single kind of edge and then incremented it every time there was one. So we see that here, and then I've added some colors to sort of distinguish different subgroups, and we'll get into more detail later. But when we do this kind of transformation, we can study not only the content of the tweets, but various subcommunities inside those networks of communication, as well as pathways of influence. And in particular here, we're interested in how popular people on Twitter influence mainstream media narratives. So that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit more about. So here we go. First, the theoretical foundation. I won't take up too much time on this, but not everyone on the call is a sociologist. So this work is fundamentally grounded in something called public sphere theory. This was coined in the 1980s by Habermas, who was speaking about kind of historical French salons, which as best I can understand is something like a coffee house. And he said, look, in an ideal democracy, folks gather in these public spaces and they deliberate whatever the item of the day is, so whatever it is that needs to be decided or adjudicated by the community. They make a decision about how they think things should happen, and then they roll that up to the elected officials who then enact it in law and policy. Right, so this is how a democracy should ideally work, a deliberative democracy, right? So fast forward about a decade, not even, and folks like Nancy Fraser and others said, look, that's a great idea, and yes, of course, we want deliberation to happen, but at the same time, we all know that not everyone is included in those public spaces, right? So neither historically nor currently are public spaces and public deliberation available to everyone. And so Fraser coined this idea of the counterpublic sphere. So it's not that folks, people of color, trans folks, LGBTQ folks in general, people with disabilities and so on, it's not that they are totally disenfranchised. It's that they aren't necessarily invited to these predominantly white male spaces in order to have conversations and influence politicians. So what they do is they gather in their own spaces. They have conversations there, and then they use their kind of collective power in order to infiltrate those mainstream spaces to ultimately influence decision makers. Okay, with me. Okay, fast forward a little bit more time, Yochai Benkler noticed, hey, people aren't going to coffee houses anymore, right? But that doesn't mean deliberative democracy has ended. What people are doing is they're gathering online. So folks are now having those deliberations in online spaces, and these places are called networked publics. You know, fast forward just a little bit more, and along comes Sarah and I. We said, look, you know, although the internet is somewhat more permeable and open, the way that we form networks and our communication online sort of disenfranchises, you know, people of color, LGBTQ folks, and so on, in a way that is not dissimilar to the way that people didn't have access to the coffee houses, right? So not everyone has access to the kind of mainstream spaces online, even though they might technically have access, their voices are not heard there. And so what do? They go ahead and form these networked counterpublics, right? So they're still online, they're still communicating, and they're still advancing their own issues. And this is the networked counterpublics storyline, the piece that we're trying to demonstrate and explore in the book. We give lots of different examples, and we like argue for their existence and their efficacy. That's what I want to talk about today. I'll give you two examples, and I forwarded you two journal articles that are related to these two case studies, so you all have access to that. Hopefully you had a chance to look at them. All right, so network counterpublics. They do two main things, and I picked two case studies. One does one a little bit more, and the other does the other one a little bit more. So the first thing a network counterpublic does is it provides space for support and affirmation for all the experiences of folks who live outside the mainstream. And now every single person on this call is outside the mainstream on some dimension, so you know what this feels like, right? So where your lived experience is not exactly the same as what's being communicated or what's popularly understood to be quote unquote normal, right? So one of the really important functions of these spaces online and offline, but we're talking about online today, is to just affirm those experiences. Say like, what you're experiencing, yes, that's real, right? So that's a thing that really happens, and it's happened to me too. Okay? The second piece is to create sort of transformative advocacy and activism, right? And particularly to introduce these alternate narratives. So like our lived experience is, it may be outside the mainstream, it may be not the thing that's getting covered all the time, but it is legitimate and other people ought to know about it, right? So again, remember the gold standard here is to get covered in the mainstream press in terms of, you know, public awareness of your issue. All right, so these two case studies sort of track each one of those goals a little bit differently. So the first one I'm going to focus on really leans heavily on the support and affirmation and a little bit on the advocacy. So this case study is the GirlsLikeUs hashtag. So as I mentioned up front, this is a hashtag that was started by Janet Mock, who is then the editor of a fashion magazine called Marie Claire. She wasn't particularly well known, although not entirely unknown. And she herself is a trans woman and decided to become more of an outspoken advocate for trans rights following the disqualification of this woman here in the picture, Jenna Telekova. She was a candidate in the Miss World pageant or Miss Universe pageant, and she was disqualified for being, quote, not a natural born female. So folks, Janet put out this tweet asking folks to support this petition, and it got retweeted lots and lots of times, sort of set off this movement around the GirlsLikeUs hashtag to support trans rights more broadly. I will go through the kind of network data collection and network composition in more detail than I normally do, because I think folks here will be interested. So what we did in order to do this study, I collected at Northeastern, we have a garden hose, or had a garden hose feed. So I collected all of the tweets in that 10% sample from Twitter that were sent between June 2012, when that first original tweet was sent, and June 2015, so a 3-year period. There's about 15,000 tweets, which is 10%, so you do the math in your head, that's fine. I created these interaction networks, so it's people, individual users connected by retweets and mentions. That resulted in a network that was just shy of 7,000 nodes connected by about 10,000 links. So here we use a little sleight of hand here. So as you know, not all network measures are robust to data loss. So when you're working with a 10% sample, you have to be a little bit careful about how you're analyzing the network because you can't do everything well. But we luckily here have a nice confluence of kind of theory about how information spreads online, as well as network science, right? So the specifics of how networks work. So on the theory side, Zizi Papakarisi, looking at the Arab Spring data on Twitter, sort of came up with this idea of crowdsourced elites. So here, it's a certain set of people in any given online network are going to become popular by virtue of the interaction with them. So all the people who are using a particular hashtag will go through and kind of suss out what messages they think need to be heard, right? So, and you've probably done this. You go on Twitter and you're like interested in a topic. Some people will craft their own tweets, but many people will go through and just find other tweets that they kind of agree with, and then they retweet them. And it's this subtle form of communicative upvoting, right? And through that, we get a sense of what the community thinks is important. So rather than us as outside researchers saying, this is the message that's most indicative of what Girls Like Us is about, I have no business doing that, right? So instead, I rely on the women and men who are in that network to pick folks, and they did that. So we find just like in many networks, we find that the degree distribution on this particular interaction network follows, I'm not going to wade into this conversation too heavily, but something like a power law, right? And we see that, only a very tiny number of nodes get a kind of outsized or disproportionate number of the links on a network like this. And so that not only is robust to some of the data loss that we know we have because we only have a 10% sample. It also follows this theory really nicely. So here's a case where we marry the theory and the network science and are able to pull out fairly reliably and fairly confidently who we think are the most popular people in this network. Now, of course, there is some chance that we did not get the most popular people. Random samples are random samples, so there is some outside chance. But just to give you an idea of the magnitude, many of the tweets we're talking about in these, from these popular users are, on the order of thousands of retweets. So, right, it's very unlikely mathematically that we miss someone who's important. And in fact, when we go out and pluck out the top 10 nodes by in degree, so people interacting with them or retweeting or mentioning them, we see, not surprisingly, Janet Mock is right at the center. So she's the top most interacted with person with almost 15% of the total content in that whole network. Next after Janet Mock is Laverne Cox, who is an actress, most famously probably on Orange is the New Black. She's also a trans woman. So this sort of checks out. It's at least a face validity check that the people that we might expect to be at the center of this network and kind of occupying a disproportionate amount of the content are in fact people who are recognizable or legible as activists in this space. All right, so that's what we did. We found these top 10 people, and then I went back to the data and scooped up any tweet that had their username in it. So that would include all the content both by them that they authored originally and also about them. The nice thing about this is that it allows us to kind of, again, skirt around this data limitation problem where a lot of what we get is retweets. So we'll see not maybe the original tweet that, say, Janet put out, but a retweet of that tweet. And if anything is retweeted, more than 10 times, we have a decent chance of finding a copy of it somewhere in the data set.
Are you willing to accept questions during your talk?
Sure, especially right now because we're on the technical details.
So we have a question from Nicholas who's asking why the 10% random sample.
Mm-hmm. The question is why?
Yeah, he writes, why a 10% random sample? Sorry if I missed it.
Oh, so Twitter does not let most people have a full full access, but Northeastern had, through like a complicated historical situation, kind of proprietary access to this 10% sample. We had a garden hose feed from the start of Twitter until 2016. So that's what we had to work with. Getting data. So the other option that many people use is buying data, but buying data of this size, I like do the math real fast in my head. You know, a data set of this size, about 15,000, even 15,000 tweets, much less 150,000. If we were trying to get the whole thing, would be like maybe $20,000. It's expensive to buy tweets. So that's what we had to work with, and so we, you know, use some sleights of hand to make sure that we were focusing on analyses that we could actually reliably conduct with this 10%. That's a good question, though. All right, so I took those tweets. So we have this top 10, this list of top 10 people that are reasonably confident are in fact popular in the network, and I went back to the data set, pulled out the tweets with their usernames in them, and that's what I gave to Sarah and Moya to do the discourse analysis. So moving forward, you're going to see this sort of combination of network analysis and then like interpretive work around what it is they're saying. I should note, I assume the vast majority of people on the call are scientists, empirical scientists. That critical discourse analysis comes from a slightly different epistemological view. So you're allowed to kind of talk about what should be, not just what is, right? And that we can talk more about that if folks are interested. But you will see me making kind of value claims, which is like allowed in that kind of research. All right. So moving forward, this is the network we got. We can see a couple of interesting things. I also limited this like really a lot. I think I limited it to people. The links are all like over an age weight of 100, right? Meaning that there were like 100 interactions in order to see any pattern at all. So we see this kind of purple halo occupying most of the page. That is the network centered on Janet Mack and Laverne Cox. They're the two biggest nodes inside that network. We also see this interesting little green sort of octopusy looking thing on the bottom. This is one of those puzzles that happens when you do mixed methods. We're like, look at that, looks pretty important, right? What's happening there is actually two women inside the center of that network. We spent a great deal of time sussing out whether or not they were actual people. They are. I even spoke with one in real life, or virtual life anyway. I DM'd on Twitter with her. They're conservative women, who one of whom is trans, one of whom is not, who set their location to hashtag #GirlsLikeUs. It's not totally clear that they understood what they were doing. Certainly the one who is trans did. It's not totally clear to me the other one did. And sort of had all of these people in the halo around them are conservative followers who probably didn't realize that they were kind of signal boosting the Girls Like Us hashtag when they were doing the retweeting. So most of these retweets are content around the 2016, or like in the lead up to the 2016 election. So they're content, pro-Trump content, which is just like, I don't have a lot more to say about that, but it's a helpful reminder that identity and politics are not necessarily the same thing, although trans folks tend to be liberal, they're not exclusively liberal. And also we can see this really nice kind of haloing effect, which of course I've exaggerated with the network layout, but we see very little crossover. There's very little retweeting across near complete fragmentation of this green section. So we see the folks in that part of the network are not engaging with the majority of the Girls Like Us network and the more liberal pro-trans messaging, nor are the folks in that part, in the pro-trans part of the network, engaging with the conservative content, right? So we see almost no retweeting across, which you'll see in the next network is like pretty rare. We don't usually see like complete separation like that. So just an interesting little aside. Anyhow, so this network is centered on these two women who are now reasonably famous when the network started, arguably not. I mean, Janet Mock, for example, had about as many followers as I do now. So take that for what it's worth. They've gotten more popular over time, and the kinds of things that we're doing are the exact kinds of support and affirmation stuff that I was talking about before. So we do of course see some kinds of activisms, and this whole thing started around a petition. There were subsequent petitions. So this is Liver and Cox advocating for a petition to free Cece McDonald, who's a trans woman who is imprisoned in a men's prison after she defended herself against a knife attack in a bar. We also see folks pushing back against like intentional misgendering. There's a big spike in activity when Caitlyn Jenner kind of publicly transitioned in the US. We also see a lot of stuff around various policies to like eliminate trans rights or to limit trans rights or trans access to public spaces. So this is what we would consider more formal advocacy or activism. And it's certainly in there and part of this network. But more commonly, we see just kind of everyday support. So we see folks celebrating folks winning awards, Gina Rosero winning a GLAAD award. We see folks supporting folks going through gender confirmation surgeries, just regular folks. I mean, this person here is not anyone famous. And we even see the kind of famous people going through and supporting, in this case, for example, this is a high school girl who's getting bullied for her trans status, right? So we see Janet Mock specifically reaching out and engaging in that kind of support. So here, it's just a lovely reminder of how support and affirmation can work in these networks. And I would also note that unlike maybe some other forms of organizing where these things happen behind closed doors, this becomes really interesting performance of advocacy, right? So people, I'm guessing, are not meaning for this to be a kind of advocacy or activism, and yet, talking about things like gender confirmation or anti-trans bullying in public, particularly when it's performed by celebrities, is itself really powerful, right? So it sets a tone about what is and isn't acceptable. It gives people language and vocabulary to talk about these things, and it allows a kind of casual observer, or maybe even a nascent supporter of things like trans rights, to go in and observe how to be a good ally, right? So seeing these things in public is probably more potent than it is even when it happens in an offline setting. All right, so I'm going to transition now to the second case study, which I will go a little faster through the network science part of it or the data part of it. It's the same. I do the same thing every time. This one certainly leans more on advocacy and activism, and particularly it's a nice example of how folks insert these alternate narratives into mainstream public. So this is the case of myNYPD. So this one happened in April of 2014. For those who are a little fuzzy on their history, this is pre-Ferguson, it's post-Trayvon Martin, but pre-Ferguson, pre-kind of widespread conversation about police violence against people of color. If anyone's calling in from outside the US, I think this is probably common knowledge now, but it also is worth noting that in the US, Black folks are killed by police officers all the time. Our police carry guns and they shoot people. All kinds of folks are killed by police officers, but Black folks in particular are disproportionately killed by police officers. And it's not usually newsworthy. So we can unpack the horror of that later on. But that is the truth. In particular, in New York City, this is all coming on the kind of heels of a very recent, at the time, Supreme Court ruling that a particular style of policing called stop and frisk was unconstitutional because it was disproportionately targeting people of color to be kind of detained and harassed in the streets. So like, you can't do it that way anymore. And so this is all this is the ether in which myNYPD was born. Okay, so here's what happened. The New York City Police Department issued this tweet. It said, do you have a photo with a member of the NYPD? Tweet us and tag it, #myNYPD. It may be featured on our Facebook. For those on Twitter, this went about as well as you might imagine. So what happened is we saw, you know, a couple dozen photos like this. There was some feel-good photos of police officers at Yankees games. Police officers on horses were really popular. And then thousands and thousands of photos like this one. So where police were committing acts of violence in public and photographed, right? So we collected the data from that same 10% sample over the course of the 2 days and put together a network. So yeah, here's just some basic. So this was a pretty popular hashtag, about 13,000, a little more than 13,000 tweets. Again, that 10% random sample. Well, I put this in for the benefit of a reviewer who was like, why didn't you just read all of them? It's a lot. It's a lot of data. So created that same kind of interaction network, extracted the largest component, which was a little over 7,000 nodes and 8,000 links. Pulled out those crowdsourced elites. Again, in this case, I cut it at top 12 because there was like a significant drop off, so that made most sense. And this resulted in about 2,500 tweets that we actually analyzed to figure out what was going on. Okay, so same thing as last time, just different data. So what we were expecting, so at the time, all of the prevailing information about how information moves on Twitter is that there would be some sort of traditional elite in the middle of this, right? So we saw lots of like studies coming out right around this time debunking this idea that things go viral in the same way that viruses go viral, right? So that like it passes from person to person to person. And instead that things go viral on Twitter largely by getting into the hands of celebrities or like traditional media makers, right? So Twitter's basically a broadcast virality, right? If we could even call it virality. That's where network science was in 2014. So much to our surprise, we got this. So here, it's a slightly more complicated network, although like much more indicative of the sort of thing we would see. So like I said, we rarely see that kind of fragmentation in the Girls Like Us network. And instead, we see these like little starbursts of like popular accounts surrounded by people who are otherwise not interacting with each other too much. But if you notice, the folks who are popular in this, we do see some kind of notable accounts. So Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Bay Street right in the middle were the most retweeted accounts. And these are the accounts associated with the Occupy movement, which was just a couple of years prior. But then if you look kind of around them, the next most popular accounts were largely small activist organizations like Copwatch, or just individual people. So Morin again is, you know, just like an individual activist. Kamani Film is the parents of a boy who was killed by police officers. They were trying to get a documentary made about him. The Real Kiori, Vice, and Molly Crabapple, like these are kind of alt news organizations. Vice has since gotten a little more popular, but as you can see, these are not, you know, we don't see, for example, the New York Times would be an obvious choice if we were going to pick an elite influencer with a lot of followers at the time, or maybe a celebrity with ties to New York. We don't see any of those folks inside this network. Which was a surprise to us, right? So if something's trending, it's getting a lot of attention in the mainstream press, in addition to Twitter. We would have expected a more elite set of people in there, but we did not find that. So Sarah and I kind of mulled this over, and thankfully, Police Commissioner Bill Bratton gave us the answer we were looking for. So he said, he was the police commissioner at the time in New York City, and he said in a press conference, quote, "Most of the pictures I looked at, they're old news. They've been out there for a long time." And this, of course, is exactly the point, right? So at the time that myNYPD trended, it's not as if all these incidents just suddenly happened, right? They had happened a long time ago. And in fact, a lot of people had tried to get attention for those incidents before. I mean, Kamani Film, right, was trying to make a movie out of this incident. They had documentation of what had happened, and yet they couldn't get any traction, much less mainstream news coverage. I mean, none of this appeared in the mainstream news. And yet, on account of this hashtag kind of bringing together otherwise disparate stories under an organizing umbrella, the hashtag itself became newsworthy. So the hashtag itself got covered in the news, and as a collateral of that hashtag, a lot of these images actually got the kind of air that they were looking for and had been looking for a long time. So among other things, we saw several news articles that kind of covered the hashtag as a PR failure. So we see CNN, we see here the Washington Post, New York Magazine did a longer piece, and then some, admittedly fewer, but some actually covered the the kind of spirit of myNYPD. So not just this as a PR failure, but this as an example of a kind of narrative that normally doesn't get covered. This one was particularly poignant. So this is Ari Melber sitting in for Lawrence O'Donnell in Last Word on MSNBC. And he said, and I'm going to read you the quote directly, quote, "Anyone who follows politics today knows about the simplistic and often false choice of whether we should be agitating on the internet or on the streets. But here's the thing about most of the photos. They were all taken in the streets. They all happened in the streets, yet many of them didn't achieve initially any great impact, let alone response from the city or press until they found traction through the online publishing platforms." So we see, thanks to Ari Melber for writing the conclusion of our paper, we see that all these previously disconnected stories came together online. So folks who never on their own were able to get attention or challenge mainstream narratives about policing in New York City in this example, were able to advocate collectively as a counterpublic and influence what the mainstream media was covering. Now, we don't have a counterfactual world where I can have this event not happen and then see, oh, did Ferguson still happen anyway? But I don't think it's that coincidental that this happened 4 months before. We had a widespread mainstream national conversation about police violence in Ferguson. So that is the kind of argument overall in the book. And I will wrap it up there. I'll just give you a few takeaways. So what was this talk about? Hashtag activism as a practice is new, but it has these familiar roots. People have long used media in order to counter mainstream narratives. This kind of dual work, support and activism, influences mainstream conversations in a variety of different ways. Hashtag activism, we argue, is an effective tool for marginalized people to create social change. And then last but not least, keep tweeting, right? So hopefully this talk convinces you that hashtag activism has a lot of promise, that it can create transformative social change. And of course, I focused on the kind of opinion leaders or the most notable people for lots of reasons that I explained. But those people are only notable because all of us are retweeting them, right? So regular folks have a big role to play. Each one of us is not so important, but all of us collectively decide what narratives are deserving of attention. So I'm going to end there, but I will show you two more gratuitous plug for the book. So please order from your local independent bookstore. You can find details on the MIT Press site, or we have our own website as well that covers these case studies and lots of other things. And then last, as promised, my fantastic and brilliant co-authors. If you're not following them on Twitter, you should be, because they say smarter things than I do all the time. And I will stop. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I can stop.
Let's open the floor for questions. We already have a raised hand. Nicholas, do you just want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I can unmute. Thanks for a great talk.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Very, very cool. I was curious, you were talking about kind of the mechanisms and kind of comparing it to the diffusion of information paper. And I was kind of curious if you had looked at, say, like the evolution of tweets over time. I don't know if that's like a ton of work, but like the time series.
So we do it qualitatively. I'm not confident that we have a large enough sample to do any good quantitative inferences. but we definitely do it qualitatively, both within certain cases and across all the cases in general. So just some trends that I'll note, particularly when we studied Ferguson, which was an extremely large network, even at a 10% sample. We saw this pattern that then sort of emerged in other networks as well, where often what happens is the initial tweets are community members, right? So they're folks who are kind of outraged by this thing that's happened in their neighborhood. Ferguson, for those who don't know or remember, was when Mike Brown, a Black teenager, was killed by a police officer kind of in broad daylight and then just left in the streets for hours. So understandably, his community had something to say about that. And we saw a lot of folks tweeting about it. And then based on those tweets, we saw local kind of community organizers get involved. So people like pastors, city councilors and stuff, and local celebrities, right? So not famous people like in any widespread sense, but locally famous people got involved. And then that kind of bubbles up over time. So once like politicians and regional celebrities get involved and regional news gets involved, then if enough regional news is covering something, then like national news might cover it. And then Ferguson became a whole thing, right? So there was like widespread national coverage eventually. But the interesting thing about that case is that it started kind of with these voices of neighborhoods or neighborhood members kind of pushing back on mainstream narratives, saying like, this is not okay, right? So like the police just gunned down a teenager in front of all of us. It's not okay. And we see like inklings or reminiscence of that in the mainstream coverage. By the time it gets to the end of that week. So we do see this pattern again and again. The other thing we see throughout the book, from the kind of beginning, the 2012 hashtag activism, to the, we end around 2017 with like a little bit of 2018 in there, as we were just finishing up the book, we see once something starts, like the rate at which it accelerates gets a lot faster over time. And we think that that's because of a couple of things. So first, because we have some language to talk about, racial justice or injustice, trans rights and so on. So it became more of a national conversation. And we also saw a kind of, mainstream tweet beats, if you will. So like mainstream news outlets would actually like actively cover the daily most popular things on Twitter, thanks in part to the president using it as like a policy announcement platform. All right, so I would generally say that's bad, but like, it does get more attention for Twitter in general. So, yeah, my pleasure.
So we have another question from Adina.
Hello.
Hi,
Thank
Adina.
you. That was incredible. And I just came from reading the book, so it's perfect.
Thank you.
I know you were kind of talking about it as an aside, but I'm curious about the links that are in the network of the Girls Like Us network between the green and purple communities, because if there are links, then there were at least 100 interactions between those.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So do you know if those like were engaging with the hashtag, or they were about peripheral?
Yes. So occasionally, by chance, people who were retweeting these conservative thoughts would end up retweeting something about trans policies and anti-trans policies, right? Mostly. And so that's where like the very rare crosslinks that we discovered are almost all people kind of fighting about some take, right? So like someone has a bad take on an anti-trans policy, and then a trans person finds it and was like, I'm a real person, like stop it. I deserve to like use restrooms in public or whatever. So we do see some of this tension, and I, he didn't really elaborate on it in the book, but there's another case around Baltimore. So there's a series of protests in Baltimore following yet another police-involved shooting, where two different hashtags kind of emerged. So Baltimore riots and Baltimore uprising, and we do talk about that one a great deal because they clash together, right? So we see actually these two hashtags intersecting and people kind of negotiating the boundaries of whether what was happening in Baltimore was like the righteous and natural extension extension of decades of oppression or a riot, right? Which is often the mainstream framing around urban unrest. So we see, and we actually, we found that it was like pretty productive for the most part, that actually like it looked like people were engaging. I mean, certainly contentious, but they were engaging in deliberation, which, you know, one of the misnomers, right, the kind of snowflake red herring is that folks who advocate for liberal policies don't want to hear opposition. It's like, no, I mean, deliberation is good for democracy, right? So you know, yes, I would like to see a more liberal and progressive world. I don't think that's a secret. And yet, you know, I don't like demand silencing. Like earnest engagement in a conversation is great for democracy. You know, it's just like the kind of disingenuous trolling that we'd rather not see. But in the Baltimore case, we actually do see some productive interactions happening.
And we have another question from Lorraine.
Hi, thank you so much.
My
it was
pleasure.
a phenomenal presentation and wonderful, fabulous work. Thank you. I was curious, I know you mentioned throughout like the paper for hashtag myNYPD, you talk about like not idealizing Twitter as this platform, but also kind of really confronting the realities of this new age of activism. I'm curious if you have any recommendations for like even, you know, the empowering of activists that are maybe used to more offline activity, how to reconcile those two. And I was interested in hearing that in the book that you talk about like maybe two hashtags might be in conflict, and kind of how activists of this day and age can get more prepared in different modalities to be better able to not undermine the shared unifying message and be better at organizing, whether that's offline or online.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a lot of ways I could answer that question. One thing that comes up a lot, particularly around this kind of conflicting hashtags. So we see this a lot with like broadly speaking, the women's movement that emerged post the 2016 US election. And one of the things that's become really apparent is that, you know, in activist circles, it's a common sort of feminist activism strategy to build coalitions, right? So not everyone's going to agree on everything, and that's fine, right? So if we look at like Audre Lorde's sister, her kind of style of activism, you know, she advocates for standing side by side, even and especially when you disagree. And at the same time, folks who are new to activism, I think probably, you know, I don't have any actual evidence for this, but probably are disproportionately more likely to start online than to like show up at a big march. I could be wrong, but and you go in and you see these kinds of like dissent amongst the ranks, right? So like, is activism meant to be, is women's movement meant to be inclusive of folks who are anti-abortion, right? So that's like an issue for real debate, right? So I don't know that there's a clear answer to that. You know, yet when we play out in public, like, I think that it's like a lot easier to disengage when you see any kind of conflict. But of course, organizing like always involves some kind of conflict, right? And particularly this kind of like grassroots, broad spread organizing. So I think one piece of advice I would have for new or aspiring activists as well as organizers is to find some language to like sit with the discomfort of not having universal agreement, online or offline, but offline like it's a little easier. Because like there's more of a commitment to be there. Like it's a little more rude to like walk away from an in-person meeting than it is to just like stop following a Twitter hashtag. So that would be my first advice, and I will stop there. But we can, if you're actually looking into getting into the online organizing business, reach out. Well, we can talk some more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have another question from Anna.
Hi, thank you. This was a beautiful talk. For me, it was particularly inspiring because I am currently working with social networks and qualitative data.
Oh, great.
So this well, I'm doing offline networks, but this mixed method approach was very inspiring to me. And I wanted to ask you if you could expand a little bit on the process of choosing those 10% most influential tweets as the content for the discourse analysis, or what would be the differences between doing that and maybe comparing those discourses to the not that popular tweets or random tweets. So I'm curious just about how the process went about deciding the type of qualitative pinpoint versus the network data. Because in my case, I didn't have the network data before doing the qualitative data collection. So I am struggling sort of with that choice right now.
Yeah, it's hard, right? So for us, we were particularly interested in who was kind of setting the terms of these conversations. And then just from like a kind of usability perspective, like the folks who are getting the most attention on Twitter are most likely to get more attention, right? Because when people are like, oh, what is this Girls Like Us thing? They kind of search for it, and then you're more likely to turn up tweets from these popular people. I think it does certainly, it's going to have some effects around, say, silencing some of the dissent, right? So if we had a small but kind of fierce, counter movement within the movement, we probably wouldn't see it. So they probably get silenced, or they don't get as much attention. I do think that there could be some value in kind of comparing, like you said, against a random sample, or even a convenience sample, whatever you happen to get, of things that were less popular. The downside to that approach, though, is that a lot of the things that are less popular, it's not clear. So we don't have a great way with Twitter data, or really any online data, to track impressions, right? So, if what it's like almost, it sounds like a philosophical question, but if what you're studying is communication, like, is it actually communication if no one receives it, right? So the kind of foundational definition of communication is who says what to whom, when, and with what intent, right? So we need to have a speaker and an audience in order to have communication. Now, there are other people, say, in other fields, it's psychology, for example, where it doesn't matter if you have an audience or not, because the act of forming the communication or putting it out there is going to create some psychological effects and some psychological commitments. Now, you've said publicly, even if no one saw it, you've said it out loud, and that has an effect. So I don't know. My best advice is to be intentional about the samples you're using. Be true. Full honest disclosure, part of why we did what we did is because I knew the limits of the data, right? So I knew I couldn't, do a great audience assessment with a 10% sample. So be true to the kind of limitations of the data you have. And marrying the quantitative and qualitative methods is always a great way to kind of triangulate to make sure that you have at least some face validity to the kinds of conclusions you're drawing.
So we have a few minutes if somebody has another question to put forward. I'll let you go ahead. If not, I get to ask one too. I'm kind of one of those late adopters to everything. Within my friends, I was the last person to get a Twitter account, and I got an Instagram account about a few months ago. I always find communicating online very difficult and still foreign to me. And I was wondering if you, having studied it, have kind of an intuition for the differences in how people organize politically and communicate online versus offline, especially with Twitter, where a tweet, you can take it out of context. You don't have any safe spaces, so whenever I put an opinion out online, it's open to everyone and everybody can interact with it. And I think that changes how I put opinions out onto the internet and how I broadcast versus how I would talk in a close, confined space with a few people that I know.
Part of the answer to your question is, of course, Yes, right. So there is increased exposure online, particularly in the places like Twitter, where the norm is to be more public, right? So other places like Facebook, the norm is to be maybe not totally private, but like more restricted to, you know, like circles of people you actually know. Or Twitter, the standard is to have a public account, and it's pretty rare to have a closed account. So yes, of course, that changes the way people communicate. People in communication, the kind of term for this is the imagined audience. So people like have an audience they think is going to pay attention to them, and then they customize their communication for that audience. And you all saw me do that today, right? So I assumed that like you were like reasonably proficient network scientists, and maybe not so much social scientists, although that might be wrong, right? So the imagined audience and the actual audience like are only roughly similar. They're not the same thing. So yes, that happens. You know, the other way to answer your question is to look at what the actual sort of professional Twitter activists are doing. So this is now a common enough thing that people, you know, do this all the time, right? We see repeat participants in the centers of these networks all the time. And there are certain ways of speaking, particularly around racial justice activism, which I think has a little bit of a firmer establishment on Twitter, where the two things that people will do, and they're equally successful but for different audiences, are kind of this snarkiness. So people, for example, I think I maybe even showed it in the myNYPD case, they will post a picture of like a police officer like dragging a woman by her hair and say like, you know, missed a hair appointment? Don't worry, the NYPD will help, right? So they're being snarky. They're obviously like creating a juxtaposition between what's in the image and what the message says. So that tends to be pretty popular. And then just sort of like raw outrage is another one that tends to be pretty popular. So you'll often see photographs, you know, in like the Ferguson case, you saw photographs of Mike Brown's body in the street, right? Like just like being outraged at the injustice of what was happening in front of them. And that creates a different kind of emotional response in people. And different messages work better or worse for different people. I mean, not for nothing, I think a lot of the snarkiness actually read is more accessible to a white audience around racial justice issues, that it's like hard for many white people in America to kind of wrap their heads around the fact that the police may be okay and helpful for you, but they're not okay and helpful for people of color. And to just like have that like head on with outrage is a little bit hard for many white people as like an entry level emotion. But the kind of snarkiness, we're like, oh, okay, right? So like that, I might retweet that one because it seems a little, you know, it's like a little funny. It's a little lighter. I mean, it still is like the same awful thing, but like it's a little lighter and more engageable. So I don't think that anyone's like going out and taking like online activism trainings. I also doubt that the vast majority of the activists are like trained communication scholars. I think what's happening is this kind of like, you know, informal A/B testing, right? So you put out lots of messages, see which one takes off, and then like keep copying that style again and again. And over time, folks have kind of settled into these patterns of communication that are accessible for different audiences and different purposes.
Thanks.
Nicholas seems to have put his hand back up.
Mm-hmm.
Nice spark an idea there.
Sorry, I just have a lot of questions for you.
Sorry.
But this is, so I was curious, your work is really neat, and I was just curious if you could describe a little bit of your path, like more of your path to get there and things you've learned along the way.
Oh, yeah. So as I think I mentioned up front, I'm trained as a communications scholar. When I went to grad school, I thought I wanted to study women on the internet. And for various reasons, including like access to data sets, I ended up studying women on the internet, but particularly in virtual worlds and online communities. So I had this background in like how information or how people suss out information or form networks online. My grad school advisor was No Sheer Contractor, who those on the social network side will know for multi-level, multi-theoretical network modeling, ERGM stuff. I'll stop. So that was my background. I'm a very reluctant computational social scientist. I really did not like that label. I like adopted it when I was on the job market for my first faculty job, because like that's what people are hiring for. Like technically it was like doing big data network analysis, although I did not really, never in my life have I invented a line of code, right? So I can like take other people's lines of codes and change variables, but that's it. So that's where I was at. And truth be told, like the way that this particular project came about, I had been studying kind of information networks and how people were making sense out of you know, the various messages they would see on a platform like Twitter. My next door neighbor, office neighbor at the time, was Sarah Jackson, and she was studying critical race studies and media, right? And like myNYPD happened, and we happened to be like sitting together, right? And so we're like, oh, this is like an interesting mashup of our two areas. So we got the data, like, Sarah, what's happening, right? So that's part, and then over time, you know, these questions didn't die down, right? So we started in 2014, like online activism hasn't become less relevant. So we just kept like the case studies kept coming and coming and coming. Eventually we had to like stop writing the book. So I think we're probably done with like the individual hashtag analyses, and you know, now we're studying questions. I saw Jean Gabriel, and I think he left, but we're you know, working with Jean Gabriel, for example, to study how you know, these networks kind of smash into each other, for example. So what happens when like conflicting networks intersect? Can we predict what's going to happen, and like when they're having good conversations, even if they're contentious, versus like trolls are getting in there and manipulating what's going on? So that's the sort of thing we're working on now, thinking about bigger kind of mesoscale network patterns that exist over time.
That sounds so super cool. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that in the future. Thanks again for being here. Thanks to everybody and your great questions. And then next week is cancelled because life and COVID happens. But I'll see you all again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks again, Brooke. That was amazing.
Yes, it was my pleasure. Thank you for organizing, and thanks to everyone for coming. Yes, bye.